So Duolingo just added some features which make it actually useful for learning a foreign language, which honestly, I'd kind of given up hope of ever happening. When it came to the hopes of Duolingo ever actually being decent again, I sort of felt the same way I do about the Chicago White Sox this year. It was just like,
He's there, no, he drops it.
but it's actually improved, Duolingo that is, and we're going to look at those changes, what they mean for language learners, and by talking about what it still doesn't have, we can learn something about what we need to look out for and do as aspiring language learners in order to learn languages. And just really quickly, I want to let you know that Story Learning are doing their mid-year sale. They call it a summer sale, but I refuse to call it that because it's winter where I am. So if you're interested in learning any of up to 14 languages that they're up to now, then you'll want to know that their uncovered courses are 50% off for the next few days. If this video is less than 6 days old, then the sale should still be happening, so check the link in the description. I only ever mention them when they are on sale because why would you buy it when it's twice as much? That just doesn't make sense. Buy it when it's cheap. That makes sense. Shana chicos, to language learning and Duolingo, which have always been pretty different things in my eyes, but they've narrowed the gap a little bit.
So, biggest update first, video calls. The video calling feature involves AI, as you can imagine. You're actually talking to some of the Duolingo characters, but the latency is magical. You will be asked a question in your target language, you respond, and then they respond to your response in such a small amount of time. Like I said, I can only describe it as magic.
So if and only if you are one of the select iOS users, you can now video call an AI bot. Now, in all likelihood, this is running some sort of version of ChatGPT, whether it's 4.0 or an earlier version, I don't know. And I can see how that would excite some people, obviously, but I do find it interesting to note that to characterize their bot, they have chosen the apathetic teenager character Lily. Lily is basically April from the show Parks and Rec, except not actually very funny. What I'm getting at is that her character trait is that she exhibits no emotion over anything. She's apathetic to everyone and everything and bored 100% of the time.
Hola.
Hola?
Tengo una pregunta. ¿Te gusta recibir regalos? Como para tu cumpleaños?
I think they've done this very deliberately because it's much harder to make an AI sound genuinely emotional and excited. So this way, when people say, it sounds bored and monotone, they can just say, yeah, well, that's Lily. This just interests me. Personally, I'm not bothered. I don't care. I feel the same way about this as I do about most so-called AI, and that is, yes, it definitely has some use cases, but it's probably not really AI. We are starting to see a lot more chatter about the idea that most AI is not actually AI. For example, Noam Chomsky, among others, says that it's fancy predictive text and basically plagiarism software. So if you want to disagree with Mr. Chomsky, then you can go right ahead. For better or worse, when we say AI, most of us these days, what we actually mean is an LLM, a large language model. The other thing that I find somewhat curious about this change is that they've been teasing it for ages now. I think it was late 2019 when I first heard of this feature as a possible thing that was going to come to Duolingo. And people were talking about it like it was imminent, like in the next 6 months or so. And we're, 5 years later, 4.5 years later now. So I don't know if maybe they just thought that they were going to be able to do it sooner and the technology has just taken longer than they thought, or if they knew full well that they weren't getting this for another few years, but they just talked about it and teased it to get people interested, raise venture capital, that kind of thing. But whatever, it's here now. You still can't just jump around at will in the course, and apparently with the video calls, you can only do them once. You can't have that call again. Once you've had that call, it's done. But look, I don't think that this is a bad thing. This is a positive change, in my opinion, for language learners, but it seems like Duolingo's priority is AI, or at least the illusion of AI, which really means share price, while if it were on language learning, then they would do something like fill out the podcast feature a little more and add it to more languages. And this complete control of your so-called learning and progress through the path or the tree has been, for a while, one of its bigger problems, in my opinion, because it's the problem that causes the most other problems as a follower. The more useful parts of Duolingo are generally found further along the path, like longer lessons with more words and more complex sentence structures. You really should be able to do those whenever you want. Like, just let me do the bits that I want to do at any time. It's not that hard. This is why in my last video I mentioned that if people really desperately feel that they need to use Duolingo, then at least test out of each section and just cheat your way through the test using Google Translate or ChatGPT. That way you can at least open up the path for yourself.
As you can probably tell, the level of Spanish that she and I used was pretty basic, about A1 in the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference of Languages, you know, the OG, and that's a bit weird considering that I'm in the B1 part of the path, towards the tail end of the B1. B1 is a bit more advanced than just simple, hi, my name is Evan.
Yeah, I'm actually going to defend Duolingo here, so, you know, mark this day in your calendar. It'll be studied in future schools or something. But I would say that that is correct. They're admitting rightly that being able to tap on words and translate sentences does not equate to spoken ability. So they're starting the conversation at a much lower level than you're up to in the path, because there's not really a direct correlation. Sometimes I would argue no correlation at all. But also, I would have thought that the level was somewhat up to you, because the chatbot just asks if you like receiving gifts. So the complexity of your answer should depend on your ability, unless I've got that wrong. And another aspect of this is that people have this idea that language fluency is in direct correlation with complexity of speech, but that's wrong. As you become more fluent at a language, you realize that sometimes fluency is about being able to be brief, and sometimes even terse. I'm not saying that you should practice fluency by being brief or not saying anything at all. I'm just saying that sometimes the A2 response might be, well, I'm not really sure, while the C1 or C2 response would be, no. If you're interested, in the description, I will put a prompt that you can use for practicing your language with an AI. Now, it was written for ChatGPT, but it should work for Gemini as well. It's very detailed and it generally gets good results out of the bot. You can see what's written in the prompt so you'll know what to expect. It's not my prompt. It was written by my friend Eric. He does great personality videos too. He knows a lot about what makes people act the way they do. So check out his channel. Both the prompt and his channel will be linked in the description. And just so you know, we, meaning Eric, myself, and people who watch this channel, have tested that prompt. I've had generally very good feedback.
Over the past few months, Duo have really been leaning hard into more listening-focused lessons. At first, it's been little things like trying to incentivize you to listen rather than read by giving you more XP if you choose to turn off the words and just listen to things like stories. So anyone that likes a little bit of extra XP, who doesn't? It's a good dopamine release. We'll try that out. And that's just one little aspect. By giving people the ability to opt in to listen, it allows us to feel like, hey, we're choosing to work on that weak part of our learning experience, and it helps us so that we're not overly relying on subtitles when we're watching media. We can just listen. They've implemented quite a few exercises where the text is hidden and you have to be able to repeat what is said just by hearing, which yet again is a step in the right direction of training your ear and not relying so much on just reading.
So this is definitely a good thing in my opinion. Anything that incentivizes listening is great. I'd still like to see more listening and less babied listening. At the moment, it's way too slow and way too clear. I know that because I can understand the German stories really easily, and I do not speak German. And whenever I say this, people say, oh, but Lamont, you speak Swedish. That's why you can understand German. And I'm thinking, yep, but I don't understand actual German people, just like I don't understand Danish or Italian. I can understand those things when they're in extremely basic and slow, clear sentences, but I can't understand the real thing. So what does that tell you about the fact that I can understand German? To me, this training is just not quite lifelike enough to be genuinely useful. I'd rather see something more like Speakly has, which is 30 or so full listening exercises where someone tells a story almost like a tiny audiobook with, yes, I guess somewhat simplified vocabulary and sentence structure, but still with full native-like fluency.
Kuten jo sanoin aiemmin, minun nimeni on Pekka. Mikä on sinun nimesi? Olen 30-vuotias. Kuinka vanha sinä olet? Asun Suomessa. Olen kotoisin Tampereelta, mutta asun Helsingissä.
The reason Duolingo doesn't do this, in my opinion, is that they never want to make their user feel uncomfortable and like they can't keep up. And that makes sense from a business point of view. It's not a good business move to make your user feel uncomfortable, obviously. But unfortunately, from a language learning point of view, it's the only move that will actually get anything done. I remember thinking that I was pretty epic at Swedish because I could speak Swedish and I would speak to Swedes and they would tell me that my Swedish sounded really good. And then I would go to watch something in Swedish and think, well, I speak Swedish, so let's turn the subtitles off. And the second I turned them off, I'd think, did that just change it to Swahili? What's going on here? What was going on was that I sucked at listening because I'd never tried listening at a native level. So it is good, I think, that Duolingo is incentivizing listening, but if they ever want to progress past Little League, they need to move into native level listening. And no, the Duolingo podcast, which is definitely a better aspect of Duolingo, still doesn't count because it's still too slow, still too clear, and it has English holding your hand the whole time. I'm not saying it's useless. I think the Duolingo podcast is a great format, but it's still not native level listening. I spoke in more detail about this in my last video. My recommendation for something harder than Little League listening, but still easier than full native level, would be an audiobook of which you already know the story. Storytel is where I happen to get my audiobooks. They have a good selection in a lot of languages. And after a few books that you've already read or that you know the story of, you can then progress to listening to books that you haven't read or heard before. Some people think that my stance on this is too hardcore, but my stance on this is just reality. Do you want to play in the major leagues or not? Because native speakers are like major league pitchers. They might be nice to you for a little while, but eventually they're going to stop lobbing it down at 60 for you.
Friedel, and the pitch right there. Strike three call goes to the Heat. 100 miles an hour.
But another big update involving audio that's been slowly rolled out on Duo for the past 6 months or so involves animated characters giving a little podcast radio show type deal. First, they introduce themselves, they tell you, hey, here's some words that you should be listening out for, and then a caller calls into the program, talks about a specific topic, and they test you on your listening comprehension.
Now that is more like it. That is a leap in the right direction. Like, listen out for this word, and now you'll hear that word somewhere in this conversation that's at full speed. We're actually doing something in this video that I didn't think we would ever do, which is discussing Duolingo and language acquisition rather than language study. Unbelievable. Now look, I would check this if I could, but I don't have an iOS device, and even if I did, I would have to hope that I was one of the people in the group of people who get these features first before I could actually check it. Just because I've used so many language learning products over the years, I can imagine that it would be like, listen out for the word lamp, and then you hear the word lamp so clearly, or maybe even 10 times, or you hear it once, but the one time is like, you can't possibly miss it. That's what I'm imagining, at least. Like I said, I can't check it, but still, what I really like about this feature is that hopefully it will teach people who don't know any better that this is the heavy lifting. I feel like if it's done at all well, people will realize, oh, right, this is what I need to do more of. This is what language acquisition is truly about. I said this in my last video, but then I ended up removing it, so it was actually not said in my last video. But basically, the outtake from my last video was this. When you know a language properly, you don't hear and understand every word separately and piece together the meaning. You might think that even in your native language you are doing that, but just really quickly. But what you're actually doing is hearing and understanding the meaning in its entirety. And you couldn't not do this even if you wanted to. That's also why you can hear words in a very wrong order and still immediately understand what is being said, even though you wouldn't be able to recite the order in which those words were said. And this can only really be trained by doing just that. No amount of typing words or tapping on words on a screen is going to help you understand meaning in context at full speed.
The biggest thing that I actually really like about this podcast feature is the people that call in aren't speaking slowly. At least with mine, they're speaking Spanish and woo, muy rápido. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's very fast.
My guess is that it's probably not quite at native speed, or if it is, then they've still gone out of their way to pronounce everything extra clearly. But even if it's at sort of 80% or 90% of native speed, then that's a good thing, because people should not be mollycoddled too much when they're learning a language. When you think about it, kids are not mollycoddled and they pick it up just fine.
Och sen föll en krokodil från himlen och bet mig i baken. Lägg av!
So this is good, but it might be a case of enjoying it while it lasts, because I would not be very surprised if this feature is eventually withdrawn, because it's sort of almost pointing out that the emperor's got no clothes on. Once you realize that you can listen to things at full speed and not understand everything, but still get something out of that and still progress your target language way more than you thought you could, then you might start to question the point of Duolingo. But then again, maybe for other people, maybe even for most people, the streak is a more powerful motivator than the feeling of real progress. I don't really know.
If you haven't seen any of these updates yet, it could just be that you're not far enough in the path to have unlocked them. It might be that they're for like more advanced learners at this point. So if you keep learning, you'll get them eventually. Or it could just be that they're not yet available for your target language. A lot of the updates with Duolingo usually start at Spanish or French, and then they trickle down. Sometimes they get to German, and then that's kind of usually where they stop.
That's true. And I'll admit that it does bother me a little bit when people cite some of this stuff as a reason that Duolingo is great. And then it comes out that they're actually learning Dutch or Swedish. And I'm thinking, like, you're arguing for the benefits of a program that you don't even get the benefits of. I made a video about this a few years ago where I mentioned that the only reason to use Duolingo is if you're learning a language that is decently served by it, but that is underserved by everything else. So anything like French, Spanish, German, Italian, Mandarin, or Japanese, they are all out. You have so many resources just at your fingertips that using Duolingo for them would be like me moving to Norway for the beaches. Apparently 60 million people using Duolingo for Spanish. It's like dreaming Spanish exists and you're on Duolingo. But then moving to the less well-served languages like Swedish means that Duolingo has a lot less competition, sure, but it's also not as good itself. So personally, I can only see there really being a use case for maybe something like Scots Gaelic, Navajo, Hawaiian, and disclaimer, I have no idea if those courses are even decent on Duolingo. I just know that those languages aren't well served elsewhere, so Duolingo is at least in with a shot.
They are actually trying to use that animation studio a lot more. And now, I don't know if you've seen these yet, but in my path, I get full-on little animations of 2 or so minutes long. I think I've had 4 so far, and they actually teach you some more niche stuff that the lessons actually don't do, sometimes involving grammar. I know, Duolingo and teaching grammar?
The study of grammar is a complex topic, but if I had to say one thing about it, it would be that learning grammar is not the same as acquiring grammar. And because people don't realize that there is a difference, they often get upset that they're not being taught grammar because they think that this impedes their ability to speak. But in reality, what impedes your ability to speak is having a weak subconscious model of the language. So a grammar explanation may well be the first step, but after that, you'll need to hear the grammar used in dozens, if not hundreds of contexts before you've actually acquired it. I'm not against the study of grammar, but if it means that people think that they've learned it because they know the rules, then I am against it, because that is false confidence. And you see this all the time. There are people who could score literally 100% on a difficult exam in that language because they know all the words and they know the grammar, but they couldn't get through a single sentence because they don't have a robust subconscious understanding of the language. I would actually say that more important than learning grammar is learning what language acquisition is, because once you know what language acquisition is and how to do it, then you also know how to learn grammar. And just in case it wasn't clear, language acquisition is the development of a subconscious model of the language that can only come through reading and listening to the language, not explanations of the language, but just the language itself.
So first thing I've noticed in A/B testing is rather than receiving the standard 10 XP and then plus 5 if you get a lot of answers correct, I'm receiving 30 XP per lesson. That's a huge jump. And they also seem to be giving XP to me out like candy, like, oh, is it a Saturday? Plus 5 XP. Is it happy hour? When is happy hour? We don't know. Plus 5 XP. Did you speak? GG, a plus 5 XP. I mean, thanks. That does add up, especially when it comes to using a 2x multiplier. So if I actually spend like 15, 20 minutes on Duolingo for the day, I like rocket up to the top of the league. And I don't think that is a feature that everyone has. My girlfriend's family has it. I have it. I have some friends that are like, what do you mean? I only get 10 XP.
This one is so weird to me. Like, obviously I don't care about XP, but it does feel a little bit unfair for them to have the leagues remain a real thing and encourage people to do well in the Diamond League or whatever it is, but then give people different amounts of points based on anything other than just how much they do. Like, Duolingo invented this points and leagues system. It seems almost like social manipulation to just randomly award certain users more points to the point that others don't even stand a chance. So yeah, that feels LA dodgy to me, but not particularly surprising.
I have tried switching into the French language on the app, but I have not been given a score. Bit annoying. So I've gotten some screen grabs from Heather and her family. So it seems the more lessons you complete, the higher your score. But what exactly is a score? It looks like it's kind of like the A1, A2, B1, so on framework, but with much smaller, easily digestible bites. So you can not only understand like what type of sentences you're able to speak at this point. Clicking into About Your Score, we can see that levels are broken down into being able to communicate certain concepts effectively. Whether that be being able to answer simple questions in a score of like 10 to 20, or discussing movies, telling stories, talking about your hopes and dreams at score 70 to 90.
They did used to have something similar to this where there were 25 levels, but each would require exponentially more XP than the last one. So to get from level 24 to 25, you would need to do almost as many points as you had done in total thus far just to move up that one level. This new system where there are more levels, I certainly don't mind. I think it could be quite a good thing because the feeling of progress is certainly something that language learning lacks, and that's possibly why a lot of people don't do it as adults. But my critique of Duolingo now and in the past has been that the feeling of progress far exceeds the reality. And by the way, that's probably why it's so popular. You feel like you're progressing, and that feeling of progressing, that's a good thing. Now, they just need to do the actual progressing part. And it's the case in language learning in general that the tools which we use to measure progress are far too simplistic. So whenever I see these progress charts or marking rubrics that say things like can discuss movies and music, but then higher up than that is can discuss faith and whether they believe in God, I always think one of those is not necessarily more complex than the other linguistically. It just seems like it is because one is more trivial and the other is existential. But if you lack automatic control of certain key elements of the language, certain tenses or idioms, then sooner or later, whether you're discussing films or faith, you're going to have a problem. Now, does that mean that I think this new way of measuring progress is a negative update, a bad thing? No, not at all, but it remains the case that any app or program or even full course with an actual teacher can only really gauge your progress to an extent. And just so you know that I'm not picking on other people here, I'll use myself as an example. I know that I would pass a C1 test in Swedish with flying colors. Now, I'm not saying that to flex, I just know that to be the case. But I also know that if we were comparing my Swedish with my English, then my Swedish is lacking a lot more than just vocabulary. It's all these little things that you barely realize exist. Things like little half nods that will mean different things in different cultures and languages. A purse of the lips that means I disagree with you. Or even just the right word for coat or jacket depending on how thick it is and whether it's winter or not. Or any of 10,000 more little things like that that are just not within my current skill set because I'm not Swedish and I've never been to Sweden. Swedish 10-year-olds would know that stuff. I don't know it, yet I would still pass the C1 exam even with a speaking component because it doesn't test for that stuff. My point being that just pointing to a number or even a level like C1 and saying, there's my progress, is a two-dimensional measure of a 50-dimensional skill. And I think that the danger of such a simplistic metric is although people understand that they're simplified, they don't realize by how much. In my last video, I talked about this comment I got from someone saying that it took them 400 days to complete Swedish Duolingo, and they'd hoped that after that they'd understand 30 to 50% of spoken Swedish and found that they understood, according to them, literally nothing. His mistake wasn't one of magnitude, because imagine if the course had been twice as long and therefore taken 800 days to complete. Would he have understood any more than he did after completing it? No, he still would have understood nothing because you can't study your way to comprehension or to fluency. I do think it's a good thing if the biggest brand in language learning, the biggest name in language learning, is actually improving in terms of real language learning, then that's of an overall benefit to the language learning community. I know that some of my viewers are actually kind of hooked on Duolingo, even though they admit that it's not that effective. So if it's improving for real towards real language learning, that's of course a good thing.
I genuinely find this a very, very, very exciting update. As I've always said, the main weakness of Duolingo is the lack of actual speaking. Not just like repeating things or saying things out loud, but listening, comprehending, and responding.
And as for myself, I am sick of talking about Duolingo, so I'm not going to talk about Duolingo anymore. In fact, to be perfectly honest, I'm sick of talking about language learning, and I'm not going to talk about that anymore. I'm going to pivot and become a baseball channel, starting right now. For my first video, I want to talk about the infield fly rule and why this call against Andrew Vaughn is the worst freaking thing I have ever seen. True to my word, I'm going to send one of you subscribers this limited edition Yankees 1996 World Series. No, look, yeah, I get it. Of course Shohei Ohtani didn't cheat. He just broke numerous laws that normally carry a lifetime ban and somehow didn't get banned. Siri is the biggest show pony ever. Get that guy out of the team. I don't care how much the bling around his neck is worth. A center fielder who can't catch and doesn't know where the strike zone is useless.
Suzuki, he's under it.
Against them with 2 outs and loaded bases, who should step to the plate but the man himself, Seiya Suzuki? You could not write this. Subscribers, you guys are amazing, but even more amazing than that, you heard the news. The Rockies are through to the World Series. Clean swing, makes a good crack, deep to left. Seiya Suzuki!
That's bullshit.
Dad.
Goodbye to Wrigley Field.
Dad, come on. Dad, you slept in. You're gonna miss your plane.
To where?
To Stockholm in like 3 hours. Your plane leaves. Let's go.
What do you mean Stockholm? There's no baseball there.
You've been learning Swedish for like 7 years. You make videos about language learning.
Oh, fy fan.
Are your bags packed?
Ja. Nu kör vi. Älskar.